When a story this big goes quiet, most people assume it has ended. The headlines stop, the search trends drop off, the comment sections go still, and the collective attention of the internet moves on to whatever comes next. That is the natural rhythm of how these things work. But natural rhythms do not always tell the truth. And in the case of Jonathan and Susie Lamb, the silence that followed Joni's funeral was not an ending. It was a breath before the next chapter, one that nobody inside that ministry was especially eager to see begin. So let us start there. Not at the beginning of the scandal. Not at the beach house or the fired executive or the lawyers and the legal filings. Let us start with two people sitting somewhere private, trying to figure out what comes next when everything they had built their lives around has just publicly collapsed. Susie Lamb said it plainly. After their story went public, she and Jonathan were scared. Not uncomfortable, not uncertain, genuinely, deeply frightened. No home base. No ministry covering them. No platform, no salary, no institution standing behind them. The firing in November of 2024 had stripped away everything that gave their lives in ministry its external structure. And now the world was watching, and they had nowhere to land. That is not a dramatic way to describe it. That is exactly what it was. When you have spent your adult life building something inside a ministry, when your identity and your income and your community are all woven into the same institution, and that institution closes the door on you publicly and permanently, you do not simply pivot. You grieve. You stand still for a moment and try to understand how much of your foundation just gave way. But then Susie said the miracle started. She began listing them, one by one. Jonathan felt a calling toward finance. This was not a random direction that appeared out of desperation. Finance was something he had been genuinely drawn to long before ministry became his professional path, something Susie had known about him from the very beginning of their relationship, 15 years earlier. She said that when he felt led toward it again, it felt less like a pivot and more like a homecoming. Like recovering a part of himself that had been set aside for years. And just having that direction, just knowing there was ground under his feet in a specific direction, gave her something she said she had not felt in a long time. She exhaled. Then there was the question of where they would physically go. They had nothing lined up. So they prayed. And what came back was not a ministry connection or a famous pastor's guest house or a church network offering temporary housing. It was a private couple, regular people, who heard their story through a mutual contact and reached out with an offer that felt almost impossible to believe under the circumstances. They said, "Come stay with us. On our ranch. In Montana. Mountains. Horses. Wide open sky. The kind of landscape that does not ask anything of you and does not require you to perform or explain yourself or manage anyone else's perception of your situation. Just space. The kind of space that lets things settle." Susie said that particular combination, mountains, horses, ranch land, open country, was a dream she had quietly carried in her heart for years. It was not something she had ever said publicly or made into a specific prayer request. It was just a private longing that she had held without expectation. And there it was. The house was brand new. It stood there, Susie said, as though it had been waiting for them specifically. The couple who welcomed them in did not treat them like charity cases or ministry casualties. They treated them like family. Like parents, almost. And for people who had just come through a season in which their own family had shut them out from a dying mother's bedside and from a funeral stage and from a decade's worth of institutional work, the experience of being welcomed in that way was not a small thing. It was a large thing. An enormous thing. They sold their home. Moved the children to a little country school down the road. Jonathan threw himself into finance with the same seriousness he had brought to everything else in his professional life, and God blessed it. They went on road trips across Montana, drove to Bozeman, made their way to Yellowstone, traveled to Seattle, pressed north into British Columbia. They rode horses, went sledding, saw grizzly bears at close range. They lived, really lived, for what felt like the first time in years. Susie described that whole season as set apart for healing. Not productivity. Not rebuilding. Not strategy. Just healing. The kind that requires time and silence and space and the absence of the pressure that had been pressing down on both of them for years. by December of 2025, they both felt it. The season in Montana was closing. It was time to return to Texas. And when they came back, when Joni passed and the funeral took place in May of 2026 at Gateway Church in Southlake, two people made sure Jonathan and Susie were not navigating that day alone. Their names were Brenda and Jonathan, two security officers who personally arranged to drive Jonathan and Susie, along with her parents and their children, to the service. They stayed the entire time. They took care of the family from arrival to departure. Now, here is the part worth sitting with. These two officers had worked directly under Jonathan Lamb at Daystar. Not under the organization in general, not under Marcus or Joni or anyone on the board. Specifically under Jonathan. He was their direct authority inside the ministry. And when he was fired, when his name disappeared from the payroll and his role was erased and the institutional machine moved on without him, these two people did not distance themselves. They did not quietly realign their loyalties to whoever held the current title. They showed up, in person on the day it mattered most, and took care of the family of the man they had worked under. Susie mentioned them by name publicly. She did not have to do that. It was a deliberate choice. And what it signals is not simply gratitude. It is a statement about something deeper, about who stands with you when the institution has already made its decision, about the difference between loyalty to a title and loyalty to a person, about what actually endures when everything official has been stripped away. Then, just days before this was written, Jonathan Lamb drove out to a specific location in the Las Colinas area near Dallas, Texas, stood in front of a television tower, and posted it to Instagram. This was the site of the first broadcast tower his father ever acquired for what would eventually become Daystar Television Network. Marcus Lamb had built the ministry from a single station in Montgomery, Alabama, and when he brought it to Dallas, the growth truly began. But the tower itself was a miracle by every account Marcus ever gave of it. The plot of land it sat on occupied a narrow strip between the flight paths of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport and Dallas Love Field Airport. To build a broadcast tower, you cannot be inside the restricted airspace of either. And there was this one piece of land, a riverbank plot in the Las Colinas area, that fit precisely between those two airspace boundaries. Marcus acquired it. And from that tower, Daystar's signal went out across the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex in its earliest days. Jonathan stood there, looked at the tower, and spoke about it simply. He said it was a miracle his father had been able to acquire it. He said that without it, the television ministry in Dallas never would have taken off. He said he had just come out there to take a little visit, to walk a little down memory lane. That is not an accidental post. That is a man standing at the foundation of something his father built and saying, without theatrical staging or pointed language, that he has not forgotten where this came from, who built it, or what it was for. It is not a threat and it is not a demand. It is a son returning to something that belongs to him by blood and by calling, standing quietly in front of it, and letting that image speak. Before we go any further, it is worth going back to the beginning. Because to understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what Marcus and Joni Lamb built and why the people asking the hardest questions about it are not outsiders. They started from nothing. One station in the Dallas area in 1993. Through years of faith and sacrifice and risk and fundraising and relentless broadcasting, they grew it into a network reaching over 64 million homes across the United States, touching virtually every country on earth. This was not a business venture that happened to acquire a religious brand. It was a ministry, built on a specific calling, funded by viewers who gave generously because they believed in what they were watching. Jonathan Lamb grew up inside it. He did not arrive from outside and seek a position. He was born into it during the same week his parents launched one of their earliest stations, a timing that those who knew the family have described as meaningful, as though the two things were always meant to be connected. He worked inside it for years as vice president. His wife Susie served alongside him on air. Their names were on it. Their lives were woven through it. And that is why the questions they have raised are not the kind that fade quietly. When the sharpest scrutiny of an institution comes from the people inside it who have the most to lose by speaking, you are not dealing with an agenda or a smear campaign. You are dealing with a family that fractured in public because something inside was broken in ways they believed could not stay hidden. Jonathan and Susie came forward publicly and alleged that members of the family, including Marcus and Joni themselves, had covered up the abuse of their young daughter by a male relative, a man identified in public reporting as Pete, a name that police interviews have since connected to Josh Brown, Rachel Lamb Brown's husband. They gave that account publicly. They documented it. They went on camera. They stood behind it. Before her death, Joni dismissed those allegations and characterized them as a power play, Jonathan's way of trying to position himself for leadership in the wake of his opposition to her marriage. That was her account. Those two accounts cannot both be fully true. But here is what responsible coverage of this story requires saying plainly: the matter was investigated by civil law enforcement. The Colleyville Police Department closed the investigation in May of 2025 without filing charges, citing the child's lack of a formal outcry to authorities. The investigators noted that if she ever made such an outcry, the case could be reopened. An accusation is not a conviction. A closed investigation is not a disproof. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and any person of genuine discernment, especially a person of faith, has to be able to hold both without turning them into a verdict. That is not a comfortable place to sit. But it is the honest place. Doug Weiss entered Joni's world after Marcus died. He had appeared on the network many times as a guest, a psychologist who had built his entire professional platform on the premise of healing broken marriages. He ran a counseling center in Colorado Springs, Colorado, called Heart to Heart. He wrote books. He produced videos. He created what he described as a comprehensive system for couples working through betrayal, addiction, and broken intimacy. And for years, he sat on platforms including the Lamb's own program talking about his wife Lisa, praising her publicly, describing their connection, using his own long marriage as the living evidence that his methods produced results. That was the foundation his credibility rested on. Then Marcus Lamb died in November of 2021. Less than 2 months later, Doug filed for divorce from Lisa, the woman he had publicly celebrated for decades. The divorce was finalized in May of 2022. Doug did not announce it publicly until February of 2023, 8 months after it was finalized. In the meantime, he continued counseling clients in intensive programs premised on his expertise in saving marriages, under the assumption, left uncorrected, that his own marriage remained intact. He was also, during this same period, dating Joni Lamb. He and Joni were engaged. He married her in June of 2023, roughly 18 months after Marcus died. That timeline is a matter of documented public record. The explanation Doug offered for the divorce centered on a concept he calls intimacy anorexia, the idea that a spouse can deliberately and intentionally withhold emotional, sexual, and spiritual connection from their partner, not out of exhaustion or trauma or depression, but as a calculated, willful choice. He diagnosed his wife of 30 years with this condition. The woman he had called phenomenal in public for years became, in this framing, someone who had been covertly withholding from him the entire time. There is something important to understand about that term. Intimacy anorexia is not a recognized diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the reference guide used by credentialed psychological professionals. It is not recognized by any legitimate professional psychological association. It is a term Doug Weiss himself invented, developed into a framework, and built commercial products around. He used his own self-created concept as the justification for ending the marriage his reputation was built on. The record surrounding his counseling practice adds further detail. 7 former female clients came forward to the Roy's report describing intensive programs at Heart to Heart that left them more traumatized than when they arrived. They described being told not to show emotional reactions when they learned, during pre-polygraph disclosure sessions, that their husband's infidelity and addiction were far worse than they had known. They described being pressured to quickly resume sexual intimacy after those devastating revelations. They described polygraph tests administered with far more questions than professional standard support, in some cases up to 10 questions, when licensed polygraph professionals say no more than 4 is the accepted standard. Most of their husbands passed those tests at heart to heart. Most failed subsequent tests administered elsewhere by independent examiners. Colorado's state licensing boards issued letters of admonition to Weiss twice. Once in 2002 for misrepresenting his credentials by calling himself a licensed marriage and family therapist when he did not hold that license, and again in 2010, when the boards found that during a 3-day intensive he had created more adversity between a couple, elevated their marital discord, and rushed both of them toward discussions of divorce rather than attempting any standard therapeutic interventions. He accepted that order. He agreed to its findings. This is not character assassination. These are licensing board records and client accounts reported by accredited journalists, investigated with professional rigor, and published with sourcing intact. Jonathan Lamb stood at his father's tower recently and said something simple. To God be the glory for what was built here. He said that without that tower, his father's television ministry in Dallas never would have taken off. He did not say, and here is why it should belong to me. He did not say, and here is why what happened to me was wrong. He just stood there and remembered. He looked at what Marcus built with his own hands and his own faith, and he remembered it out loud for anyone watching. There is a board right now carrying the weight of what comes next for this ministry. There is a legal process moving through a Fort Worth courthouse around Joni's estate and the trust Rachel now administers as trustee. There are questions about Doug Weiss's future at the organization that have not been officially answered. There are questions about Jonathan's return that have not been officially resolved. There is a family that fractured in public and has not yet found its way back together. And in the middle of all of it, there is a man who spent a season riding horses through Montana with his wife and children, watching grizzly bears, driving through Yellowstone, healing. A man who came back to Texas. A man who stood at the first tower his father ever built, said this is what God did here, and remained ready to serve. That is where the story is. Not finished. Not fading. Still unfolding with more at stake than any single headline has fully captured, and with a cast of people whose choices in the coming months will determine what Marcus and Joni Lamb's life work ultimately becomes.